My daughter left me alone with her son for one afternoon, and by the time she pulled back into the driveway, the boy she'd told everyone would never speak again was standing at the front door, asking me why she'd lied to him for 6 years. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me down in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how the woman I trusted to raise my grandson turned our family into a cage. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when the whole rotten thing finally cracked open. I was sitting on the back porch of my daughter Renee's house, working through a crossword puzzle and half listening to the wind chimes she'd hung along the eaves, when I heard something fall inside. Not a loud crash, just a soft, deliberate thump, like a book dropped on purpose. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, the same chipped blue mug I'd been drinking from since my wife passed 4 years back, and I sat there for a second telling myself it was nothing. Renee had asked me to watch her son Caleb for a few hours while she ran to what she called a wellness seminar, 2 towns over. Caleb is 16. He hasn't spoken a word since he was 10 years old. The doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma, the trauma being the car accident that took his father, my son-in-law Danny, on a rain-slicked highway outside of Harrisburg. I never questioned that story. Why would I? I'd buried my own son once, in a manner of speaking, when Danny married into our family and then was ripped right back out of it, and I'd watched my grandson go silent right alongside the rest of us grieving. For 6 years, I drove out to that house every single week. I read to that boy. I cooked for him. I sat with him in total silence because that was the only language Renee said he understood anymore. I never once thought to ask why a boy who'd lost his voice to grief still flinched every time his mother walked into a room. I got up from that porch chair slower than I'd like to admit, my knees cracking the way they do now, and I walked toward the sliding glass door. That's when I saw him standing in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands, and he was not the boy I thought I knew. Caleb was standing on his own 2 feet, no cane, no wall to lean against, staring at a drawer he'd just yanked open so hard it had come clean off its tracks and hit the tile floor. That was the thump I'd heard. I froze in the doorway. My first thought, God forgive me, was that somebody had broken into my daughter's house, and I was looking at a stranger rifling through her belongings. Then he turned his head and looked at me, and I saw my grandson's face, but I did not see my grandson's eyes. There was something sharp and alive in there that I had never once seen in 6 years of silence. Caleb, I said, and my voice came out cracked, barely above a whisper. Caleb, what in God's name? He didn't answer right away. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a mile, and his hands were shaking against the countertop. Then he spoke, and I want you to understand. This boy had not said a single word to me in 6 years. Not at Christmas, not at his own father's grave, not once. His voice came out rough, like something dragged up from the bottom of a well. Grandpa, where does she keep the folder? The blue one. I stood there like a man who'd been struck by lightning. My knees nearly went out from under me right there on the linoleum. Caleb, you're talking, I said, which I know sounds foolish now, stating the obvious back at a boy who clearly already knew he was talking. But that is exactly what came out of my mouth, because nothing about that moment made a lick of sense to me. He didn't smile. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. My grandson had just done something that should have felt like a miracle, should have had both of us on our knees thanking whatever's out there, and instead his face looked like a man walking through a minefield. He looked past me toward the driveway, like he expected headlights any second, even though Renee wasn't due back for hours. There's no time, he said. She's going to know something's wrong the second she walks in. I need that folder before she gets back. What folder, son? Talk to me. You haven't said a word since you were 10 years old, and now you're asking me about paperwork? I reached out for him, the same way I would have reached out to steady him, if he'd actually needed steadying. Except he pulled his arm back before I could touch him, not out of fear of me, I understood later, but because he'd trained his whole body for 6 years to flinch away from anyone reaching for him. I've been talking the whole time, Grandpa, he said, and his voice cracked on the word Grandpa in a way that split me right down the middle. I just wasn't allowed to. Not where she could hear. I want to tell you I processed that calmly. I did not. I stood in that kitchen with a puddle of spilled orange juice from the fallen drawer soaking into my socks, and I felt the floor of my whole world start to tilt sideways. Before I go any further, If you've ever trusted someone completely with the people you love most, only to find out later they were wearing a mask the whole time, I want you to type the word listening in the comments right now, because what my grandson told me next is going to make you check the locks on your own front door. He told me to help him to the hallway closet, and I did, because whatever was happening, my whole body understood on some animal level that we were now on the same side of something, and that side was against my own daughter. He pulled open the closet door and reached up onto the top shelf, past the winter coats, and pulled down an old shoebox I had genuinely never noticed in 6 years of visits. Inside was not shoes. It was a cheap prepaid phone, cracked at one corner, and underneath it, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, was a single sheet of paper covered in a child's handwriting that had slowly, over the years, in the same box, matured into a young man's handwriting. Diary entries, except they weren't dated by month and day. They were dated by the day she raised her voice to the mailman, and I flinched, and she made me stay in my room until dinner. They were dated by the day I asked why I couldn't go to school like normal kids, and she cried for 3 hours and told everyone I'd had an XD episode. She never let me go to school, Caleb said, his voice getting steadier the longer he used it, like a rusted hinge working itself loose. Not once, since I was 10. She told everyone I couldn't handle it after Dad died. Told the whole family I was fragile. Told the school district I was homeschooled. There is no homeschooling, Grandpa. There's just me, in my room, with a locked door on the outside. Locked from the outside, I repeated, because some part of my brain refused to let the words sink in whole. She installed it the summer after Dad's funeral, he said. Told you all it was a safety latch, in case I sleepwalked. I remembered that conversation. I remembered nodding along to it at a family dinner, telling Renee what a good, careful mother she was being. I felt something hot and sour crawl up the back of my throat. But Caleb, your father, Danny, the accident. You went silent because of the accident. That's what the counselor said. That's what your mother told the whole family. She said you saw it happen. You were in the car. I wasn't in the car, Caleb said, and for the first time his eyes actually met mine dead on, and what was in them was not grief. It was rage, cold and precise, the kind that takes years to build and never once loses its edge. I was at Aunt Diane's that whole weekend. I didn't see anything. I didn't stop talking because I was traumatized. I stopped talking because she told me if I ever spoke to anyone besides her about anything that happened in that house, she would tell everyone I was dangerous, that I'd hurt myself, that I needed to be put somewhere. She was 26 years old with a dead husband and a settlement check the size of a house, and she needed a reason nobody would ever come looking too closely at either one. I sat down hard on the hallway floor, my back against the wall, my legs simply refusing to hold me up any longer. 41 years I spent as a claims adjuster before I retired. 41 years trained to sniff out a lie in a stack of paperwork thick enough to choke a mule, and I had let this happen 3 feet from my own front porch on a weekly basis for 6 straight years. I had believed every single word. The folder, I finally said. Tell me about the folder. Caleb reached into the shoebox one more time and pulled out a phone number, written in pencil on the inside flap of a matchbook, so faded I had to squint to read it. Mr. Fenwick, he said, Dad's old business partner. Before he died, they were building something together. A patent, some kind of water filtration system for disaster relief. Something Dad believed in more than he believed in almost anything. I remember him talking about it before I turned 10, before everything went quiet. Mom told the family the business folded when Dad died. It didn't fold, Grandpa. She's been running it under a company name none of us have ever heard, and Mr. Fenwick has been trying to reach her for 6 years, and she's been intercepting every single letter, every phone call, telling him I was too traumatized by my father's death to ever discuss the business, using me, using my grief, as the reason nobody could ever ask her a single question about where that money's been going. I want to pause the story right here, because I know some of you are already guessing what's in that blue folder, and some of you are already furious on my grandson's behalf. And I promise you, what we found in the next hour was worse than anything either of us imagined sitting on that hallway floor. We had maybe 2 hours before Renee's seminar let out, and I made the decision right then, the same way I used to make a call on a claim that everybody else in the office was too scared to sign off on. I helped my grandson to his feet, and I want you to understand, this was a boy whose 6 years of forced stillness had left with legs like a newborn colt, muscles that had simply never been allowed to build themselves properly, and every step he took toward my truck was an act of pure will, fighting against a body that had been kept small on purpose. He told me later that he'd spent nearly 2 years secretly doing push-ups against his bedroom wall in the dark, holding himself up on the doorframe when she wasn't listening at the door, forcing blood back into legs that were never actually broken, just never allowed to move. We drove to the address Mr. Fenwick had given years back in an old email Caleb had memorized, word for word, because Renee had never let him write anything down that she could later find. It was an industrial park on the edge of town, the kind of place with identical beige buildings and no signage worth mentioning, and behind Unit 14 was a modest little workshop with the name Briggs Fenwick Water Solutions stenciled on frosted glass, so faded it was nearly invisible. A heavy-set man in his 70s came to the door, and the second he saw Caleb, something happened to his face I will never forget. He went pale, then he went red, then his eyes filled up so fast he had to grip the doorframe himself. "My God," he said. "Danny's boy. You've gotten so tall." Then he looked at me, and back at Caleb, and he said the words that turned my blood to ice water. "Does your mother know you're here?" We told him no. We told him everything, right there in that workshop doorway. And Mr. Fenwick's face went through something I can only describe as a man watching 6 years of confusion finally arrange itself into a shape he'd always suspected but never dared to say out loud. He brought us inside, past shelves stacked with prototype filtration units, past a wall of blueprints signed in Danny's own handwriting, and he sat us down at a metal desk and told us the truth he'd been sitting on because every time he'd tried to bring it to family, Renee had told him Caleb was too fragile to be reminded that his father had died mid-project, that raising the business would send the boy into a spiral he might never recover from. The patent, it turned out, had been fully approved 8 months after Danny's death. A disaster relief contractor with government ties had purchased exclusive licensing rights for an amount that made my stomach turn over just hearing the number out loud. Mr. Fenwick had been trying for 6 years to locate Danny's surviving family to release Caleb's rightful half of that licensing income, since as Danny's only child, it belonged to him the day he turned 18, held in trust until then. Renee, listed as the boy's legal guardian, had spent 6 years telling Fenwick's lawyers that any contact with Caleb regarding the business would constitute, quote, reckless emotional endangerment of a traumatized minor. She wasn't just hiding a business. She was sitting on a trust fund worth more money than I made in my entire career, one that was legally her son's, and every single year that passed with Caleb silent and homebound was another year that money sat under her sole control as trustee, drawing interest, funding a life none of us back home had ever seen. "She's been draining it," Fenwick said quietly, sliding a folder across the desk. The exact folder Caleb had asked me about back in that kitchen, except this was Fenwick's copy. Small withdrawals, consulting fees to herself, property management fees for a house she doesn't own outright. It's not obvious if you're not looking close, but I've been looking close for 6 years because nobody would let me look at the boy. I sat there in that workshop with the blue folder open in front of me, looking at numbers that didn't belong in a modest, split-level house with a locked bedroom door, and I understood finally, completely, why my daughter had needed her son to stay silent. A traumatized, mute boy generates sympathy, generates space, generates a world of adults who nod along and never ask a single hard question. A healthy, talking 16-year-old asks where the money went. We didn't confront her that day. Caleb was firm about that, and honestly, so was I. A man doesn't spend 41 years adjusting insurance claims without learning that the worst thing you can do with hard evidence is wave it around before you know exactly how to use it. Fenwick made calls that afternoon to an attorney who specialized in guardianship fraud, a woman named Patricia Ordway who had apparently handled cases like this before, cases where a parent uses a child's manufactured incapacity to maintain control over an inheritance or settlement. We spent that evening, and the following 2 days, building a case in complete silence. Caleb sleeping at my place for the first time in 6 years, sitting at my kitchen table every night practicing full sentences out loud, like a man relearning a language he'd never fully forgotten, just buried. The court date came 6 weeks later, and I want to tell you, watching my grandson walk into that courtroom under his own power, wearing a suit Fenwick had bought him because he'd outgrown everything he owned in 6 weeks of finally eating properly and finally moving his own body, was the proudest I have ever been of anyone in my life. Renee sat at the opposing table in a soft gray dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, the same performance of grief she'd been running for 6 years. And for the first time I watched her realize, in real time, that the audience had stopped believing her. Patricia Ordway laid out 6 years of intercepted mail, 6 years of forged homeschool documentation, 6 years of trust fund withdrawals that didn't match a single invoice, and a psychological evaluation, ordered by the court, that found Caleb had no history of trauma-induced mutism whatsoever. What he had was 6 years of coached silence, reinforced by isolation, reinforced by a locked door that the judge made her admit to under oath, staring down at her own signature on the hardware store receipt. The judge did not go easy on her. He said, and I remember this word for word because I've turned it over in my mind every night since, that there is a particular and specific cruelty in stealing a child's voice not through violence, but through convincing an entire family that silence was simply who that child had become. He revoked her guardianship. He ordered a full forensic accounting of the trust. He referred the matter for criminal fraud charges that are, as of this telling, still working their way through the system, and word has it she won't see the outside of a courtroom as anything but a defendant for a long while yet. It has been 8 months now. Caleb lives with me, in the house I raised his mother in, which is a strange and heavy thing to sit with some nights, but mostly it just feels right. He's enrolled in the local high school as a junior, testing above grade level in nearly everything, because it turns out a boy locked in a room with nothing but library books and a father's old engineering notes for company teaches himself an awful lot. He talks constantly now, like he's making up for lost years one sentence at a time, and some nights I have to tell him to slow down, not because I'm tired of listening, but because I want to make sure I catch every single word he was never allowed to say before. Last weekend we drove out to that same industrial park, and Mr. Fenwick handed Caleb a set of keys to Unit 14. He's 16 years old, and he already knows more about his father's water filtration design than most men learn in a lifetime of engineering school, and Fenwick's talking about bringing him on as a junior partner the day he turns 18, which was always, in some sense, the plan Danny had for him before that highway took him from us both. I think about that locked door a lot. Not the one in Renee's house, though God knows I think about that too. I think about the door inside my own head, the one that stayed shut for 6 years because it was easier to believe my daughter's grief than to ask why my grandson never looked me in the eye. A father's instinct doesn't stop the day his children have children of their own. It just gets quieter, easier to talk yourself out of, easier to explain away with a story someone tells you often enough and gently enough that you stop checking whether it's true. I nearly lost my grandson to a silence dressed up as sorrow, and I will spend whatever years I've got left making sure he never has to earn the right to speak in his own house ever again. If someone in your life has ever gone quiet in a way that never quite sat right with you, I want you to sit with that feeling instead of talking yourself out of it, the way I did for 6 long years. Love does not require you to stop asking questions. The people who truly care about you will never ask for your silence as proof of it. Tell me down in the comments, have you ever had a gut feeling about someone in your family that you buried because it was easier than facing it? I want to hear your story tonight. And if this one moved you even half as much as living through it moved me, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Sometimes the people we love most learn to go quiet because it feels safer than being heard, and we mistake that silence for peace instead of asking why. A gut feeling ignored for years is still a gut feeling worth trusting. Real love never needs someone else's silence to survive. It grows louder, freer, and warmer the moment truth is finally allowed to speak. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its little life lesson still found its way into your heart.